What should have been a 15-minute walk turned into an endless nightmare, where shadows moved on their own and the stars didn't belong to my sky. The familiar road twisted into something unrecognizable, lined with hollow trees that seemed to breathe. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, I heard a voice not calling for help but for me. I was halfway down the wooded path when the air changed. The familiar hum of the city had faded entirely, swallowed by an unnatural stillness. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, not even the faint rustle of a breeze. Just silence thick and suffocating. The moon above flickered, casting the trees into momentary darkness, and I froze. I glanced up, expecting clouds to have rolled in. But the sky was clear, the stars unnervingly bright and unfamiliar. The silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it felt deliberate, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I shook off the unease, telling myself it was nothing. Exhaustion was making me paranoid. But then I heard footsteps. They were faint at first, barely noticeable, but unmistakable. Someone was behind me. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps didn't stop. They continued for two slow, deliberate beats before abruptly halting. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. But the path behind me was empty. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling slightly. It echoed back at me, distorted, as if the trees were mocking me. I forced myself to move, walking faster now, gripping the straps of my bag tightly. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Just keep going," I told myself. "It's just your imagination." But then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard a voice, raspy and distant, calling my name. "Sam." It wasn't loud, but it felt close. Too close. The sound wrapped around me like a cold hand on my shoulder. I stopped breathing, frozen. In place. The voice came again, quieter this time but unmistakable. "Sam ... I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I sprinted, their claw-like fingers snagging at my jacket. The voice still echoed faintly behind me. But I refused to look back. I just had to reach the end of the path, the streetlights, the city, anything familiar. But the path didn't end. I should have been close to the other side by now, but it kept stretching endlessly ahead. Worse, the trees began to change. They leaned closer together, their trunks twisting unnaturally, their roots clawing at the ground. It felt as if they were hurting me, forcing me deeper into the forest. My lungs burned as I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed the broken branch on a tree beside me. I'd seen it before. I had passed this exact spot. My shortcut had turned into a loop. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not possible." I turned around, my legs trembling, and retraced my steps. But within minutes, I was back at the same tree. The broken branch seemed to mock me, daring me to try again. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. A faint metallic scent drifted on the breeze, coppery, sharp. I wanted to believe it wasn't blood, but my stomach twisted at the thought. The stars above me were wrong too. The constellations I'd grown up with were gone, replaced by strange, jagged shapes that made no sense. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stumbled forward, desperate for any sign of escape. "To keep moving," I told myself. "Don't stop," but the silence was alive, crawling over my skin. Each step felt like I was walking deeper, into something I couldn't come back from. And the voice? It was closer now, whispering my name like a promise. The faint red glow came from somewhere ahead, flickering like a dying ember in the dark. My feet moved toward it before I even realized it. I wasn't thinking, just following, as though the light had hooked something deep inside me and was pulling me forward. Pulsed, rhythmic and deliberate, like a heartbeat, and with every step, the silence of the forest seemed heavier, the air thicker. When I stepped into the clearing, the light was gone, but something else was there. A figure stood motionless in the center. Tall. Impossibly thin, it was cloaked in shadow, its edges blending into the darkness around it. My chest tightened as I tried to make out its face, but there was nothing, just emptiness where features should have been. Still, I felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, as though it could see every thought in my mind, every secret I'd ever buried. "Why do you run?" it asked, its voice fragmented, like static breaking through a bad connection. The sound wasn't coming from it. It was all around me, vibrating in my skull. "What are you hiding from?" I stumbled back, my legs trembling. My throat felt too dry to speak, my breath too shallow to scream. Its words lingered in the air, cold and sharp, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. Then it moved just slightly, a shift in the shadows. That was all it took. Panic took over, and I bolted, my feet pounding against the ground. Behind me, the clearing vanished like it had never been there, the trees closing ranks as if they were alive. The path twisted and warped ahead of me, unfamiliar and unending. No matter which way I turned, I wasn't escaping. I was being pulled deeper. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes, hours. Time had lost all meaning. The forest was endless, its oppressive silence broken only by the crunch of my footsteps on the dead leaves and twigs beneath me. My phone was useless now, its screen dead no matter how many times I jabbed at the power button. The moon hung frozen in the sky, unmoving, casting a pale light that made everything look washed out and wrong. My throat burned with thirst and my legs ached with every step, but stopping felt impossible. The moment I stopped, I knew the forest would close in on me. Then I saw it, a wooden signpost standing crooked at the edge of the path. Relief surged through me. Maybe it marked a trail out of here. But as I got closer, the words carved into the wood stopped me cold. "Turn back. Turn back." The letters were smeared with something dark and viscous, dripping onto the ground beneath it. I wanted to believe it was mud, but the coppery tang in the air said otherwise. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, darting between the trees. I turned, but there was nothing there, only the faint rustle of disturbed leaves. They weren't attacking, but they weren't leaving either. They were watching, their presence pressing against me, like a weight on my chest. I stumbled forward and saw a puddle of water glinting faintly under the moonlight. Desperate for something to quench my thirst, I knelt beside it. But when I looked down, the face in the water wasn't mine. It grinned, its teeth too sharp, its eyes glinting with malice. My scream tore through the silence, but it only made the shadows laugh, a deep, guttural sound that came from everywhere and nowhere. The forest felt heavier now, the air thick with a suffocating tension that pressed down on my chest. I moved mechanically, my thoughts scrambled, desperately seeking any shred of clarity, any sign that I was still in the world I knew. And then, through the haze of panic and exhaustion, I saw an abandoned campsite. The fire pit was cold, the wood charred and scattered, long forgotten. My heart skipped a beat as I stumbled toward it, drawn to the eerie stillness. Littered across the ground were scraps of old fabric, a torn blanket, and a leather-bound journal. Its edges were weathered and scratched, as though it had been tossed aside, left to rot. I picked it up, my hands shaking. The weight of it felt significant, as though the answers I was searching for lay inside, waiting to be uncovered. I flipped it open, and immediately my eyes were pulled to the chaotic scribbles inside. The handwriting was frantic, as though the writer's mind had been unraveling with every word. I've seen them, one entry read. The eyes in the dark. They follow you. The trees, they aren't just trees. They move when you aren't looking. They're watching. I turned the page, heart pounding in my chest, feeling the weight of the words settle into me. The writer spoke of looping paths, glowing eyes that never blinked, and an endless night that couldn't be escaped. And then I read it. Don't trust your shadow. The ink on the page was smudged with something dark, something that looked too much like blood. I froze, the journal still in my hands, but my body numb. Someone had been here before. Someone had walked these same cursed woods. And they hadn't made it out. I felt the air shift. Something was watching me now, too. I stood there, clutching the journal, the reality of it sinking in with cold, creeping dread. The woods were alive, their silence suffocating, watching my every move. I had to keep moving, but the ground beneath my feet felt wrong, as if the earth itself was shifting beneath me, pulling me deeper into its trap. It was then that I noticed it something off, something I couldn't ignore. My shadow. At first, it was subtle. I thought I was imagining it, but no, it was lagging behind. When I moved forward, it stayed still for a moment, longer than it should have, and when I stepped to the side, it didn't match my movements. I stopped dead in my tracks, my blood running cold. The shadow didn't move at all. It just lingered, and then it shifted. It wasn't like my own shadow anymore. It stretched unnaturally, a dark outline that no longer mirrored my actions. I watched in horror as it twisted, lengthening, contorting into a shape that wasn't mine, a distorted version of me standing a few feet away. The shadow grinned, though its mouth was too wide, its teeth too sharp. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. "You think you can leave?" the shadow taunted, its voice a cruel mockery of my own. "You belong here now." I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, words trapped inside. The shadow stepped closer, its form growing larger, its grin widening, and then it lunged. Instinct took over. I ran. My heart was in my throat as I pushed my legs to move faster, but the woods seemed to warp and twist around me. The trees grew taller, their branches weaving into an impenetrable canopy, blocking out the little light left. The ground beneath my feet cracked open in places, threatening to swallow me whole. I heard the laughter, dark and hollow, following me as the forest bent around me like a maze. There was no escape. The red glow burned brighter as I moved forward, the forest parting before me like a living thing. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat heavy and thick with dread. And then, I saw it. The massive tree stood before me, its trunk hollowed out, its roots twisted, like a million claws reaching for the sky. The light pulsed from within, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Inside the tree sat the keykeeper. It was neither fully man nor fully tree. Its body was made of thick, gnarled roots that twisted up from the earth, blending with bark so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. Its face was a smooth expanse of wood, featureless, except for two glowing eyes and a mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, as if it could swallow the world whole. "You seek escape," it said, its voice an unsettling mix of growls and whispers. "But escape comes at a cost." The air around me thickened, suffocating my lungs. I was trapped, unable to move, as the keykeeper's eyes bore into me, pulling at my deepest fears. Suddenly, visions flooded my mind. My parents stood before me, faces twisted in disappointment, their eyes cold as they looked at Mike. I was a failure. I reached for them, but they vanished into mist. Next, I found myself staring into a mirror, but the reflection staring back was wrong. It was me, yes, but distorted skin, pale and stretched tight over hollow cheeks, eyes black and empty. Then, the worst one, myself, walking these cursed woods forever, never seeing another soul. My body twisted and decayed into one of the shadowy figures that haunted the trees, forever trapped. The keykeeper's grin stretched wider, and I realized it wasn't just showing me my fears, it was feeding on them. I wasn't here to escape. I was here to become part of it. I couldn't breathe. The keykeeper's voice echoed in my head, its words a poison that sank deep into my skin. I felt my fear tightening, threatening to consume me completely. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. I thought of the journal, the warning, "Don't trust your shadow." I looked down, my shadow stretching unnaturally long, its form twisted, mocking my every move. It wanted me to fail. It wanted me to stay. The shadow surged forward, trying to pull me back into the visions, to trap me in the nightmare forever. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I couldn't let it win. I grabbed a nearby branch, sharp and jagged, and plunged it into the ground where my shadow writhed. It screamed, a sound that rattled my bones, as if the earth itself was protesting. The darkness began to coil and twist, shifting like smoke, and with one final scream, it dissolved, leaving nothing but the fading echo of its presence. The world around me collapsed. The trees turned to ash, their charred remains disintegrating into the air. The ground split open beneath me, and the sky peeled back, revealing nothing but an endless void. The keykeeper's form crumbled, its roots twisting in on themselves as the wood turned to dust. I felt the pull of the void, the crushing weight of everything around me unraveling. And then, with a sudden jolt, the world snapped back into focus. I was lying on the side of the road, the soft light of morning warming my face. The sound of cars passing by, the distant chirping of birds, it was also normal. Too normal. I sat up, gasping for air, but something inside me felt wrong. The world looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The air had changed, as though it was thicker now, colder. Something was watching me. Something was still waiting, hidden just beyond my sight. The morning sun felt strangely cold as I stood up, the familiar world around me seeming too bright, too ordinary. The hum of cars passing by, the distant chatter of people, it all felt so wrong. The forest should have been behind me, a nightmare fading into nothing, but the feeling of being watched never left. It clung to me, a weight on my back, heavy and constant. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was over. I was free, but I couldn't ignore the shadows. They seemed darker now, stretching unnaturally long across the pavement, as if they were waiting for something or someone. My heart raced. As I walked down the street, I caught sight of a reflection in a storefront window. For a moment, I thought I saw him, the shadowy figure from the woods, standing behind me, just out of reach. I spun around, but there was nothing. Only empty space. My breath caught, my pulse quickening, but no one was there. The chill in my bones didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just nerves, but as I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushed against something that shouldn't have been there. A piece of paper. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and unfolded it. It was a torn page from the journal. The handwriting was fresh, as though it had been written only moments ago. You were lucky. This time. My stomach dropped, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. The words burned into my mind. I didn't leave. I hadn't escaped. And I knew then that whatever followed me out of the woods had never really let go. A gust of wind swept through, and for just a second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows ahead of me, a figure. Hunched, just beyond my sight. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching from the shadows? I tried to outrun it, but it's not bound by the rules of life and death. It moves in ways I can't comprehend, through walls, over rooftops, across places it shouldn't be. No matter how far I run, it's always just behind me, silent and unyielding, watching, waiting. And what's worse, it's not human. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty. I could barely keep my eyes open after my late shift at the diner. The night was thick, swallowing everything around me in a haze of darkness. The only sound was the steady hum of my tires, a lullaby that made my eyelids heavier with each mile. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. My heart jumped in my chest. It wasn't human, at least not like anything I had seen before. Its form was too still, too unnatural, and it stood under the weak glow of my headlights, casting long, sharp shadows that twisted strangely. I slammed on the brakes, my breath catching, expecting the worst. But just as quickly as I had seen it, it was gone. I froze, staring at the empty road. The brakes still squealed beneath me, but the figure was no longer there. I shook my head, trying to breathe normally. It was nothing. Just my tired mind playing tricks. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the same empty stretch of road, but instead I felt a shift in the air, a coldness creeping in. The feeling wasn't gone. It had only shifted, like something was watching me. I glanced again, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter, but there was nothing. My heartbeat drummed in my ears, as if my body couldn't decide whether to be terrified or calm. It wasn't just my imagination anymore, it was real. Something was following me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. And no matter how many times I checked, I couldn't shake the sense that it was right there behind me, waiting. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the air felt suffocating. The quiet darkness of the lot seemed heavier than usual, pressing against me like a physical force. I had told myself I'd be fine once I got inside. Just shake it off, right? But as soon as I stepped out of the car, my feet froze. The door to my apartment was slightly ajar. I always lock it. Always. A sharp, uneasy panic rose in my throat as I walked cautiously toward the door. Was I sure I locked it? Maybe I hadn't. No, I always do. My mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. I pushed the door open slowly, my hand trembling on the handle, half expecting someone to be standing inside. But the apartment was still, dark, nothing out of place, nothing had been taken. The kitchen was just as I'd left it, the couch untouched. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the wind or the building's old locks had pushed the door open. I didn't want to think it was something more. Then I heard it. A soft scratching sound, faint but unmistakable. I paused, the hair on my neck rising. At first I told myself it was the pipes. Old. Buildings made weird noises, right? But no. This was different. It wasn't the pipes. It was coming from the walls, crawling under the surface like something alive. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. Was it a rat? No, this wasn't the sound of a rodent. It was too deliberate, too persistent. It was almost like something was trying to burrow through the drywall. My breath quickened. Couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor. The noise grew louder, more frantic. It was right behind me. No, I couldn't stay here. I turned and ran to the hallway, my pulse thundering in my ears. But when I turned back, the sound stopped. It was dead silent. I imagined it. Then the whispers came. Just below the surface of my thoughts, an awful, cold voice. It wasn't words, just an awareness, a pressure against my mind. I tried to shake it off, to ignore it. But that night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure again, the one in the far road. This time it was closer, standing at the edge of my bed, staring at me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. Something was there, watching, waiting, and I couldn't escape it. I couldn't focus. The world felt blurry, like everything was seen through a fog I couldn't escape. I went through the motions, pouring coffee, wiping down counters, but my hands shook. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that followed me everywhere. As I moved between tables, I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. When I turned, I saw a shadow standing just outside the diner, pressed against the window like it was trying to look in. It was too still, too wrong. My chest tightened and I froze, unable to pull my gaze away. The shadow didn't shift, didn't move, it just watched. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart in my throat, but when I blinked, it was gone. Just vanished. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked around the diner, at the faces of the regulars, but no one seemed to notice anything out of the ordinary. They went on with their lives, while I stood there, paralyzed with the heavy knowledge that something was watching me. The rest of the day dragged on in a haze. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just beyond the corner of my eye. Everywhere I went, every turn I took, I felt eyes on me, strangers' faces watching with too much intensity, too much emptiness. I couldn't make sense of it. I needed to get out, to breathe fresh air, to clear my mind, so I went to the park. But the air didn't feel fresh. It felt thick, like the world was pressing in around me. The trees, the benches, even the people, they all seemed wrong. Their eyes were vacant, distant, like they were puppets without strings. Their faces blurred into something grotesque. As I walked past, and the fear in my chest expanded, choking me, I couldn't stay here. By the time I got back to my apartment, the walls felt like they were closing in. The tapping had returned, louder this time, as though The walls themselves were alive, moving beneath my feet. It felt like something was crawling, something desperate, something that wanted to get to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I sat at my computer, searching through forums, reading about hauntings and strange occurrences, but nothing seemed to fit. Nothing felt real enough to explain the horror tightening around my chest. And still, the tapping in the walls continued, relentless. I couldn't pretend anymore. Whatever it wasn't just in my head. Something was here, something that had followed me into my apartment. I had to face it. That night, I grabbed a flashlight and crawled into the crawl space beneath the apartment, my hands trembling as I knelt into the dark. The air down there smelled stale, thick with dust and dampness, but it felt like the only way out, like maybe if I found it, I could make it stop. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I moved deeper, and every time it went dark, I felt the darkness pressing in closer, like it was swallowing me. The walls around me seemed to hum, as though they were vibrating with something alive, something waiting. The silence was suffocating. My breath echoed too loudly in my ears. When I reached the corner of the crawl space, I paused, my flashlight sweeping the area. The walls were cracked, stained with years of neglect. I moved closer, my heart pounding, searching for anything that would explain the sound I kept hearing, the noise that followed me everywhere. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it slow, steady, unmistakable, a breath. But it wasn't from the walls. It was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. I was alone, yet the air felt charged, thick, with something I couldn't explain. My skin crawled, every nerve in my body screaming for me to leave. Without thinking, I bolted out of the crawl space, my legs weak, my breath ragged as I slammed the door behind me. I locked it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely turn the deadbolt. I pressed my back against the door, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. I tried to sleep, but the moment my eyes closed, I was back there, in the crawl space, alone. And then I saw those figures again. In my dreams, they shifted, writhing, impossibly long limbs twisting unnaturally. One of them was holding my face grinning at me with that wide, sickening smile. It was too much to bear. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. There was no other choice. The apartment felt too small, the walls too close. The air was thick with something I couldn't escape. So I packed my things in a frantic rush, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. I kept telling myself that a change of scenery would help, that getting out of town, away from everything, would make it stop. But the moment I stepped outside, I saw it again. The shadow. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. But no, it wasn't the way the shadows usually move. It was wrong. It was moving too fast, sliding along the edges of the parking lot, following me with a relentless precision. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced as the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was close, closer than it had ever been before. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I had to drive, to get as far away as possible. So I sped off, the tires screaming against the asphalt, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. But no matter how fast I drove, no matter how many turns I took, I couldn't escape. The feeling that something was always just behind me. Every glance in the rearview mirror showed nothing, yet I could feel it closing in, waiting for the right moment. Then my phone rang. I didn't even want to answer it, but something made me. When I picked up, all I heard was static. It crackled and popped like a broken signal. My breath caught in my throat. I tried calling back, but the line was dead. Panic surged through me as I slammed my phone into the cup holder. I took a random street, hoping I could lose whatever was following me. But as I rounded the corner, the feeling grew stronger, more suffocating. It was here, it was with me, no matter where I went. The road stretched on, but so did the darkness. The presence was unrelenting, right on my tail, never leaving me alone. I didn't know where else to go. I drove for hours, ending up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, hoping for some peace. Some moment of quiet where I could just catch my breath. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. It was in. The air thick, oppressive. It was the same weight, the same feeling I'd been carrying with me for days, but now it was worse. The clerk at the front desk looked at me strangely, like he recognized me, but I couldn't place him. His eyes were empty, hollow, like. He wasn't really looking at me. He handed me the key without a word, and I took it, the metal cool in my hand. But there was no comfort in it. I opened the door to my room, and it hit me immediately, the weight. The air inside felt thick, heavy, as though it was pressing against my chest. The room was dim, but I couldn't escape the suffocating feeling of being watched. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself I was just tired, but I couldn't. The tapping started again, first faintly, then louder, as if it was coming from inside the walls. I froze. The sound was coming from inside the walls. I tried to shake it off, but then I heard it, a voice, low, cold, and distant, not human. Human. I couldn't breathe. I stumbled back, running for the door, but something kept pulling me back. I had to go. I couldn't stay here. But as I turned to leave, I saw them. They were standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the dim lights, still and unmoving. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt heavy, like they were stuck in place. The figures didn't move. They just watched. Then, in my mind, I heard it again, clear, calm, like a voice I couldn't escape. You can't outrun it. It's always been with you. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I understood then. It wasn't chasing me. It had never been chasing me. It had always been here. I stopped. The figures, those things that had haunted me since the moment I saw them in the parking lot, stood unmoving. Their hollow eyes never wavered from mine. I should have felt terror, should have been running faster than I ever had before, but something in me shifted. I knew, deep down, there was no escaping them. They weren't after me, and they never had been. The truth hit me like a slap in the face. They were me. These shadows were pieces of my own mind, fragments of fears I had buried so deep they had taken on a life of their own. Every whisper, every fleeting shadow, every face I'd seen but couldn't place, they had all been leading me here. They were the embodiment of everything I had refused to face, every regret, every forgotten nightmare. They were my reflection, and they had been with me always. The truth sent a cold wave through me. It wasn't just these figures, it was everything. Everything I had been running from had never been something external. It had been me all along. The tapping in the walls, the cold breath on my neck, the figures standing just out of reach. They weren't chasing me. I was chasing myself. I took a step forward slowly, with no intention of running. For the first time in days, there was clarity. I understood that this was my fate, that this nightmare was mine to bear. The air around me seemed to still, as if everything was waiting for me to accept it. The figures remained motionless, like mirrors reflecting everything I feared. And in that stillness, the darkness that had been suffocating me lifted just for a moment. I was no longer a prisoner of my fear. But then it came. A voice, soft but unmistakable, whispered through the air, so clear and intimate, it made my skin crawl. You cannot escape. The world around me seemed to flicker light to dark, then dark to light again, until all I saw was the outline of those figures, their hollow eyes still locked on mine. It was as if the entire world had been put on pause, waiting for me to realize something. More, something I couldn't quite grasp. And then, like a cold shiver creeping up my spine, it hit me. The figures weren't gone. They had never been gone. They were waiting. They would always be waiting. Because they weren't just reflections of me, they were everywhere. Maybe they've always been with you. Maybe they're with you now. As the air around me seemed to thicken, pressing down on my chest, I realized something else, something deeper than nightmare. It wasn't over. It was never going to be over. I couldn't escape myself, and neither could you. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching from the shadows?